In a frost-kissed English village, a delicate spode teacup gleams innocently on a mahogany table, its pink roses hiding a deadly secret. At a polite afternoon tea, hosted by the formidable Mrs. Lavinia Crestwell, 6 guests, each nursing a private grievance, watch as their hostess pours a second brew. Moments later, she collapses, lips blue, eyes staring, the cup shattering like a scream. Poison, swift and merciless, has struck in her own drawing room. As Inspector Craddock probes debts, grudges, and a crumbling fortune, quiet Miss Jane Marple, knitting in the corner, notices the hairline cracks in the glaze and a chipped rim that only one hand could have turned. From a solicitor's desperate greed to a fatal sip, the truth lies in the porcelain's silent betrayal, a murder as fragile and treacherous as the cup itself. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The 3rd of November had dawned with a bite in the air that made the villagers of Willowbrook draw their curtains tight and set an extra log on the fire. Miss Jane Marple, staying for a fortnight with her nephew Raymond and his wife Joan at Danemead House, had spent the morning in the library, turning the pages of a volume on ecclesiastical architecture with the mild absorption she brought to everything that might, in the end, prove useful. At 11:30, the parlour-maid entered with a salver on which lay a single envelope, thick cream paper, the flap sealed with violet wax, impressed by a crest Miss Marple did not immediately recognize. "From Mrs. Crestwell, ma'am," the girl said, bobbing a curtsy that betrayed both awe and unease. "The boy is waiting for an answer." Miss Marple slit the envelope with the silver knife kept for that purpose. The note was brief, a handwriting upright and decisive, the ink black as midnight. "Danemead House, my dear Miss Marple. I should be greatly obliged if you would take tea with me this afternoon at 4 o'clock. A small party of neighbors, nothing formal, but there is a matter of some delicacy, upon which I should value your opinion. Pray do not refuse an old woman's whim. Yours very sincerely, Lavinia Crestwell." Miss Marple folded the paper and tapped it thoughtfully against her palm. Mrs. Crestwell was not, by village standards, an old woman, 60 at most, and vigorous with it. The phrase "matter of some delicacy" carried a flavor of constraint, as though the writer had chosen each word with tongs. Miss Marple glanced at the mantel clock. 3 hours remained. She returned the ecclesiastical volume to its shelf and climbed the stairs to change her gown. The walk to Crestwell Lodge took 20 minutes along a lane overhung with leafless beech. The house itself stood back from the road behind clipped yew hedges, a solid red brick dwelling of the Queen Anne period, with a pillared porch and windows that glinted like watchful eyes. The maid who admitted Miss Marple was the same who had brought the note. Her apron was spotless. Her hands trembled faintly as she took the guest's cloak. The drawing-room smelled of beeswax and chrysanthemums. A fire crackled in the grate, throwing restless shadows across the cabbage rose carpet. 5 persons were already assembled, and Miss Marple's quick eye catalogued them with the precision of long practice. Colonel Bantry, retired Indian Army, stood with his back to the fire, legs apart, mustache bristling as though it resented the warmth. His wife Dolly, small and bird-like, perched on the edge of a chintz sofa, twisting a handkerchief into knots. Dr. Hayden, the young practitioner who had lately taken over old Dr. Mercer's practice, leaned against the window, embrasure polishing his spectacles with unnecessary thoroughness. Miss Amy Pritchard sat bolt upright in a spindle-legged chair, her gray hair drawn into so tight a knot that it seemed to pull her features into perpetual disapproval. And at the mahogany side table, arranging spoons with geometrical exactitude, was Mr. Geoffrey Spiller, solicitor of the firm Spiller, and Trent, London. Mrs. Crestwell entered last. She wore black silk that rustled like dry leaves and a cameo brooch at her throat. Her face was thin, the cheekbones prominent, the eyes a pale, penetrating blue. She greeted Miss Marple with a small inclination of the head that managed to be both courteous and regal. "You are punctual, Miss Marple. I detest unpunctuality." It is the thief of other people's time. She indicated a chair near the fire. Pray sit there. The draught from the door is treacherous. The tea equipage was already on a low table, a spode pot with a pattern of pink roses and gold rim, cups so thin the light showed through them, a silver kettle hissing gently on its spirit lamp. Mrs. Cresswell herself poured. The tea was dark and fragrant. She added neither milk nor sugar to her own cup, merely a thin slice of lemon that floated like a pale crescent. Conversation began, as village conversations will, with the weather. Colonel Bantry declared that the frost would kill the late roses. Dolly Bantry hoped it would not spoil the church bazaar. Dr. Hayden observed that colds were already rife. Miss Pritchard, whose voice had the carrying power of a bugle, announced that the vicar's new curate had preached for 37 minutes the previous Sunday, and that the collection had suffered in consequence. Mrs. Cresswell listened with half-closed eyes. When the first cup was emptied, she set the pot aside and said, almost casually, "My brother Edgar writes from Kenya that the coffee crop has failed again. Another mortgage, I suppose." One does not know whether to laugh or to cry. Colonel Bantry gave a short bark. Damned speculative nonsense. Your husband, God rest him, warned Edgar 20 years ago. Coffee. Might as well plant pineapples on Salisbury Plain. Dolly Bantry fluttered. But the natives, Arthur, surely they need employment. Natives need discipline, the colonel retorted. And a proper rifle range. Mr. Spiller cleared his throat, a sound like parchment being folded. If I may venture, Mrs. Cresswell, the trust deeds allow for certain dispositions in the event of a continued adversity. A codicil, perhaps. Mrs. Cresswell's cup paused halfway to her lips. You are very good, Mr. Spiller, but I have not yet reached my dotage. When I require a codicil, I shall send for you in the usual way. The solicitor bowed, the smile fixed upon his face like a mask. Miss Marple, who had been turning her cup slowly, so that the roses revolved like a reluctant carousel, now set it down. The tea had been strong, almost astringent. She had taken no more than a mouthful. She noticed that Mrs. Cresswell's own cup was placed not upon the tray, but upon a small occasional table to the hostess's right, apart from the others. She noticed, too, that the glaze inside that cup showed a network of minute cracks, so fine they were visible only when the light caught them at a particular angle. The kettle sang. Mrs. Cresswell rose. I will fetch fresh water. The maid is new and forgets the second brewing. She moved towards the door with the decisive step of one accustomed to command. The black silk rustled again, and the cameo flashed once in the firelight. Miss Marple's gaze followed her, then returned to the abandoned cup. Something stirred at the back of her mind, a memory as faint and fleeting as the scent of verbena. She could not have said what it was, only that it resembled the tiny click a knitting needle makes when a stitch is dropped. Chapter 2. The Fall. Mrs. Cresswell had reached the door when the silence of the drawing-room was broken by the soft clink of the spode cup being set down upon its saucer. Miss Marple's hand, steady as always, had replaced the delicate porcelain with the precision of one who has spent a lifetime arranging objects so that they might reveal, rather than conceal, the truth. The tea within had scarcely been touched. A thin film of amber liquid shimmered at the bottom, catching the firelight like a trapped sunbeam. No one else appeared to notice the small act, yet Miss Marple's pale blue eyes lingered upon the cup a moment longer than courtesy required. Mrs. Cresswell's departure left a vacuum that the remaining guests filled with the uneasy rustle of conversation. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat with the sound of a man preparing to charge a hill. Damned fine tea. What? Though I always say a drop of something stronger wouldn't go amiss at this hour. He glared round as though expecting the decanter to materialize by sheer force of military will. Dolly Bantry gave a nervous titter. Oh, Arthur, you know Lavinia doesn't hold with spirits before dinner. She says it dulls the palate. Palate be hanged, the colonel muttered, subsiding into a chair that creaked beneath his weight. Woman's got the constitution of a horse. Remember when she rode to hounds at 60? Leapt the stone wall by Farmer Gregg's place, and never turned a hair. Dr. Haydon, who had been staring out of the window at the darkening garden, turned with the air of one recalled to duty. "Mrs. Crestwell is remarkably robust for her age," he said, polishing his spectacles on a handkerchief that had seen better days. "I examined her only last month. Heart sound as a bell, lungs clear. Remarkable." Miss Amy Pritchard sniffed. "Robustness is no excuse for pride. Pride goeth before a fall, the good book says, and Lavinia Crestwell has always carried her head high enough to invite the proverb." Mr. Spiller, who had been examining the silver sugar tongs with the absorption of a connoisseur, laid them down with care. "Mrs. Crestwell's pride, if pride it be, is founded upon a considerable fortune," he observed smoothly. "Fortunes, like constitutions, require careful husbandry." The fire settled with a small avalanche of sparks. Outside, the frost tightened its grip upon the garden. The last leaves of the beech tree rattled like dry bones. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of elderly gentility. Yet her mind was busy, turning over the small observations that had presented themselves since her arrival. The maid's trembling fingers, the precise placement of Mrs. Crestwell's cup, the faint network of cracks in its glaze, the curious bitterness that had lingered upon her own tongue after a single sip. The door opened and Mrs. Crestwell returned, carrying the Spode teapot refilled. Steam curled from the spout like incense. "The water is freshly boiled," she announced. "One cannot abide lukewarm tea. It is an insult to the leaf." She set the pot upon the spirit lamp and lifted the lid to peer within, satisfying herself that the brew was sufficiently strong. Then, with the same decisive movements, she poured for herself first. The liquid was almost black, swirling darkly in the fragile cup. She added her slice of lemon, watching it float, and raised the cup to her lips. The others watched with the involuntary fascination one accords to any small domestic ritual. Colonel Bantry accepted a second cup with a grunt of approval. Dolly Bantry declined with a flutter of refusal. Dr. Haydon took his with milk, but no sugar. Miss Pritchard demanded 2 lumps and stirred them with unnecessary violence. Mr. Spiller refused politely, pleading a delicate stomach. Mrs. Crestwell drank. The cup was halfway to her lips for the second time when her hand checked. A faint sound escaped her, a sound so small that in any other company it might have passed unnoticed. It was not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, but something between the two, as though the air had been suddenly drawn from her lungs. The cup tilted. Tea spilled across the saucer, dark drops staining the lace cloth like blood upon snow. "Lavinia!" Dolly Bantry cried, starting up. Mrs. Crestwell did not answer. Her fingers opened. The cup fell, striking the edge of the table and shattering into a dozen fragments, each piece catching the firelight like a tiny mirror. She swayed, one hand clutching at the mantelpiece, dislodging the porcelain shepherdess that had stood there for 30 years. The shepherdess followed the cup to the floor, her painted smile intact even in ruin. Then Mrs. Crestwell herself crumpled. Her knees struck the carpet with a muffled thud. The black silk dress billowed briefly, like the wings of a dying crow, before settling around her in heavy folds. Her face, when it turned towards the room, was already changing, the lips blue, the eyes wide and staring, the skin beneath the powder assuming the pallor of old parchment. Dr. Haydon was beside her in 3 strides. He knelt, fingers at her throat, ear to her chest. The room held its breath. When he looked up, his face was grim. "She's gone," he said simply. Cyanosis, convulsions, classic symptoms. Poison and fast-acting. The word fell into the silence, like a stone into still water. Dolly Bantry began to cry, small hysterical sobs that seemed to come from a great distance. Colonel Bantry stood rigid, his mustache bristling more fiercely than ever. Miss Pritchard's lips moved soundlessly, whether in prayer or imprecation It was impossible to tell. Mr. Spiller's hand had gone to his briefcase. His knuckles showed white. Miss Marple alone remained seated. Her eyes, bright as a bird's, moved from face to face, noting the small betrayals, the bead of sweat upon the colonel's temple, the tremor in Dolly Bantry's handkerchief, the way Dr. Hayden's hand lingered upon the dead woman's wrist as though unwilling to accept the finality of his own diagnosis. She noted, too, the position of the body. Mrs. Cresswell had fallen facing the fireplace, her right hand outstretched towards the tea table, the fingers curled as though reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The shattered cup lay in pieces near her knee. The tea that had spilled from it had soaked into the carpet, leaving a dark stain that spread like an accusation. Miss Marple's gaze traveled to the teapot, still upon the spirit lamp, its lid slightly askew. Steam no longer rose. The water had cooled. She observed that Mrs. Cresswell's own cup, the one from the first pouring, remained untouched upon its separate table, the lemon slice now sunken and discolored. Colonel Bantry found his voice first. Poison? Good God, man, are you certain? Dr. Hayden rose slowly. I would stake my reputation upon it. The pupils are pinpoints, the lips blue arsenic, possibly cyanide. We must send for the police at once. Police! Dolly Bantry wailed. Oh, Arthur, what will people say? They will say your hostess has been murdered in her own drawing-room, Miss Pritchard snapped, her voice cutting through the hysteria like a knife through butter. And they will be right. Mr. Spiller closed his briefcase with a decisive click. I suggest we touch nothing further. The room must be preserved exactly as it is. Miss Marple rose then, moving with the unhurried grace of one who has seen death before and knows its etiquette. She approached the body, careful not to disturb the scattered fragments of porcelain. Kneeling in action that would have astonished her nephew's servants, she examined the carpet where the tea had spilled. The stain was darker at the center, lighter at the edges, forming an almost perfect circle. She touched it with one finger, then brought the finger to her nose. A faint, bitter almond smell clung to the skin. Cyanide, she murmured, so softly that only Dr. Hayden heard her. He looked at her sharply. You are familiar with poisons, Miss Marple? I have read the accounts of certain trials, she replied mildly. And I once knew a gardener who used cyanide of potassium for wasp nests. The smell is quite distinctive. The doctor's expression was unreadable. Then we are dealing with a particularly ruthless murderer. Cyanide acts within minutes, sometimes seconds. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the teapot. Yet only Mrs. Cresswell drank from the second brewing. The rest of us took from the first pot, and we are unharmed. Exactly, said Dr. Hayden, which suggests the poison was introduced between the two brewings. Or, said Miss Marple gently, it was in something that only Mrs. Cresswell consumed. Her eyes rested upon the fragments of the broken cup. Among the shards she could see the delicate pink roses, the gold rim, and most significantly, the network of fine cracks that had caught her attention earlier. The cracks were filled with a faint white residue, visible now that the cup was broken. She did not touch it, but her mind was already busy with possibilities. The sound of the front door bell cut through the tension like a knife. The maid's voice, high and frightened, floated down the corridor. The police, Madame? But Madame is. Footsteps approached. Inspector Craddock entered with the brisk authority of a man who has seen too many drawing-rooms turned into crime scenes. He was tall, lean, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. Behind him came a sergeant and a constable, both trying not to stare at the body on the floor. Craddock's gaze swept the room, taking in the shattered porcelain, the spilled tea, the rigid figures of the guests. No one has left the house? He asked. No one, said Mr. Spiller. Good. Then we begin. He knelt beside the body, his movements economical. When he rose, his expression had not changed, but his voice carried a new note of gravity. Sergeant, seal the room. Constable, telephone the divisional surgeon and the forensic people. This is murder, and I want every scrap of evidence preserved." He turned to the guests. "I shall require statements from each of you. In the meantime, no one is to leave Crestwell Lodge. Is that understood?" Colonel Bantry bristled. "See here, my good man, I've known Lavinia Crestwell for 40 years. Nevertheless, Colonel, you will remain." Craddock's tone brooked no argument. His eyes moved to Miss Marple, lingering upon the elderly lady who stood so quietly beside the fireplace. "And you, madam?" "Miss Jane Marple," she said composedly. "I am a guest of Mrs. Crestwell's, though I fear I have outstayed my welcome in the most unfortunate manner." Craddock's eyebrow twitched a minimal reaction, but Miss Marple noted it. "You will remain with the others, Miss Marple. I shall speak to you presently." As the police began their work, Miss Marple returned to her chair. The fire had burned low. The room was growing cold. She picked up her knitting, the needles moving with their familiar rhythm. But her thoughts were not upon the half-finished boutique. They were upon the broken cup, the poisoned tea, and the delicate web of human motives that had led, with terrible inevitability, to murder. Outside, the frost deepened. Inside, the drawing-room of Crestwell Lodge had become a stage upon which the ancient drama of crime and detection was about to be played out. And Miss Marple, quiet as a shadow in the corner, prepared to watch every act with the patience of one who has seen the pattern before and knows exactly where to look for the flaw. Chapter 3. The police arrive. The drawing-room of Crestwell Lodge had never known such activity. The fire had sunk to a sullen glow, throwing long shadows that danced across the cabbage-rose carpet like malevolent spirits. Constable Jenkins stood at the door with the stolid immobility of a sentry, while Sergeant Lake moved about with a notebook, his pencil scratching with the persistence of a hungry mouse. The divisional surgeon, Dr. Farnsworth, a small man with a beard like a bird's nest, knelt beside the body, his instruments laid out upon a clean towel with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Inspector Craddock stood in the center of the room, his eyes everywhere. He had the gift, rare among policemen, of appearing to do nothing while missing nothing. The guests had been herded into a semicircle near the window, where the frost had begun to etch delicate fern patterns upon the panes. Dolly Bantry's sobs had subsided into hiccups. Colonel Bantry's face was the color of a boiled lobster. Miss Pritchard sat with her lips compressed into a thin line of disapproval. Dr. Hayden cleaned his spectacles with mechanical regularity. Mr. Spiller's fingers drummed a silent tattoo upon his briefcase. Miss Marple occupied her original chair, her knitting needles moving with their accustomed rhythm. The boutique grew by slow degrees, but her attention was not upon it. She watched the police with the mild interest of one observing a familiar ritual. Dr. Farnsworth rose, stripping off his rubber gloves. "Death by cyanide poisoning," he announced without preamble. "Ingested within the last quarter hour. The almond odor is unmistakable. I'll know more after the post-mortem, but there's no doubt about the cause." Craddock nodded. "Time of death?" "Between 4:30 and 4:45. The tea was taken at," he consulted his notes, "approximately 4:35. According to the maid's statement." The inspector turned to the semicircle of guests. "I shall take statements in the library, one at a time. Sergeant Lake will remain here to ensure nothing is disturbed." His gaze swept the room, lingering upon the tea table. "The teapot, cups, and fragments of the broken cup will go to the laboratory. Constable, see to it." Constable Jenkins produced brown paper bags with the air of a conjurer. The teapot was wrapped first, then the cups. Mrs. Crestwell's own cup from the first pouring, still upon its separate table, was handled with particular care. The shards of the broken cup were gathered into a separate bag, each piece laid like a puzzle, waiting to be reassembled. Miss Marple watched the process with quiet interest. She noted that the inspector himself lifted the saucer upon which Mrs. Crestwell's cup had rested. A faint white powder clung to the underside of the rim visible, only when the saucer was tilted towards the light. Craddock's eyebrow twitched again. He placed the saucer in a bag and sealed it with tape. The first to be summoned was the maid, Elsie Briggs, a girl of 19 with a face blotched from crying. She stood in the doorway twisting her apron, her eyes darting from the body to the inspector and back again. "Now, Elsie," Craddock said, not unkindly, "tell me exactly what happened this afternoon." Elsie's voice trembled. "Mrs. Crestwell told me to lay tea for 7 at 4 o'clock. The spode set, she said, because it was Miss Marple coming. I boiled the water fresh and made the tea in the kitchen china tea, 2 spoonfuls for the pot and 1 for each person, just like she taught me. I carried it in on the tray with the cups and the lemon and the sugar. And the milk? On a separate jug. Mrs. Crestwell always poured the tea first, then the milk separate. Go on. I served the cake seed cake and Madeira, and then Mrs. Crestwell said the pot was weak and she'd make a fresh one herself. She took the empty pot to the kitchen. I was upstairs, turning down the beds. When she came back, she poured for herself first, and then offered the pot round. No one else took any, except the Colonel, I think." Colonel Bantry grunted confirmation. "And then?" "Then she drank, and she fell." "Oh, sir, I never touched nothing, I swear." Craddock dismissed her with a nod. The girl fled, her apron clutched to her face. One by one the guests were questioned. Colonel Bantry's statement was brief and soldierly. He had taken a second cup, found it strong but not unpleasant, noticed nothing amiss until Mrs. Crestwell collapsed. Dolly Bantry's was a flutter of incoherence. She had taken no second cup, had noticed nothing, was prostrated with shock. Miss Pritchard declared that she had refused the second pouring because the tea looked like stewed prunes, and she had a delicate stomach. Dr. Hayden admitted to a second cup, but claimed it tasted perfectly normal. Mr. Spiller had taken none, pleading dyspepsia. Miss Marple was last. She entered the library, a small room lined with books that had clearly never been read, and took the chair indicated. Craddock regarded her with the wariness of a man who has learned to respect elderly ladies who knit. "Miss Marple," he began, "you are a visitor to Willowbrook?" "I am staying with my nephew, Mr. Raymond West, at Danemead House. Mrs. Crestwell was kind enough to invite me to tea. You arrived at 4 o'clock?" "Precisely. The maid admitted me." The other guests were already present. Craddock consulted his notes. "You took tea from the first pot?" "A single sip. It was rather bitter for my taste." "And the second pot?" "I declined. I dislike strong tea in the afternoon." "You observed Mrs. Crestwell prepare the second pot?" "She carried the empty pot to the kitchen and returned with it, refilled. She poured for herself first, then offered it to the others." "Did you notice anything unusual in her manner?" Miss Marple considered. "She was, perhaps, a trifle more decisive than usual. But then, Mrs. Crestwell was always decisive." Craddock leaned forward. "You are known, I believe, for a certain acuteness of observation. Did anything strike you as peculiar this afternoon?" Miss Marple's needles clicked once. "Several things, Inspector." The maid was more nervous than the occasion warranted. Mrs. Crestwell placed her own cup upon a separate table, apart from the others. The glaze inside that cup showed a network of fine cracks. And the tea from the first pot, though strong, had a faint bitterness that I did not associate with China tea. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You suggest the poison was in the first pot?" "No, Inspector. If it had been, we should all be dead. Yet only Mrs. Crestwell drank from the second brewing." "Exactly." Craddock made a note. "The laboratory will tell us more. In the meantime, no one is to leave the village. I shall require you all to be available for further questioning." Miss Marple rose. "Of course, Inspector. I am always happy to assist the police." Back in the drawing room, the atmosphere had thickened. The body had been removed. A sheet covered the place where it had lain. The tea things were gone. The carpet bore a dark stain like an accusation. The guests sat in silence, each wrapped in private thoughts. Colonel Bantry broke it. Damned unpleasant business. Lavinia was a fine woman, bit of a tartar, but sound at bottom. Dolly Bantry sniffed. She could be unkind. Remember when she told Mrs. Price her hat looked like a bird's nest? Truth hurts, said Miss Pritchard grimly. Dr. Hayden replaced his spectacles. The question is, who had access to cyanide? It's not a substance one finds in every pantry. Mr. Spiller's fingers ceased their drumming. Photographers use it, I believe, and gardeners. But in a village like Willowbrook? Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes rested upon the fireplace, where the porcelain shepherdess had been replaced upon the mantelpiece, its painted smile serene amid the chaos. She thought of the white powder upon the saucer, the cracked glaze, the separate table. And she thought of human nature, which, like cyanide, could lie dormant until the precise moment when heat and opportunity combined to release its deadly power. Outside, the frost glittered under the rising moon. Inside, the drawing-room waited, silent and accusing, for the next act in the drama that had begun with a cup of tea and ended with a woman's life. Chapter 4. Motives. The library of Crestwell Lodge had been transformed into a makeshift interrogation chamber. A single green-shaded lamp threw a pool of light upon the leather-topped desk. Beyond it, the bookshelves receded into shadow, their morocco bindings gleaming like the scales of sleeping reptiles. Inspector Craddock sat with his notebook open, his face expressionless. Sergeant Lake stood behind him, pencil poised. The guests entered one by one, and with each departure the air grew heavier, as though the room itself absorbed the poison of suspicion. Colonel Bantry came first. He marched in with the air of a man advancing under fire, planted his feet upon the Persian rug, and glared at the inspector. "See here, Craddock, this is all dashed nonsense. Lavinia Crestwell wasn't the sort to be poisoned over the teacups. If someone wanted her out of the way, they'd have taken a shotgun to her on the moor." Craddock waited until the colonel had subsided into a chair. "Nevertheless, Colonel, she was poisoned, and you were present. Let us begin with your connection to the deceased." The colonel's mustache bristled. "Known her since she was a jill. Her husband and I were at Sandhurst together. Fine woman, bit sharp with the servants, but sound. Financial connection?" A pause. The colonel's eyes shifted to the fire. "Owed her a trifle. 5,000, give or take. Old gambling debt from the club. She'd been pressing me lately, threatened to call it in if I didn't settle by Christmas. £5,000 is a considerable sum." "Damned considerable," the colonel agreed. "But I'd have paid. No need to murder the woman for it. Yet the threat of exposure might ruin your daughter's engagement to young Lord Carisbrooke." The colonel's face darkened. "See here, that's going too far." Craddock raised a hand. "Merely establishing motive, Colonel." "You may go." Dolly Bantry followed, trembling like a leaf in a high wind. She clutched a damp handkerchief and spoke in little rushes of words. "I never touched the tea, Inspector. Truly I didn't. Lavinia was my dearest friend. Well, perhaps not dearest, but we'd known each other forever. She could be cruel, you know. Once she told Mrs. Dane her ankles were like bolsters. But murder? Oh no, never. And the debt?" Dolly's eyes filled. "Arthur would have paid. He always does eventually. But the scandal, if it came out before Clarissa's wedding, Lord Carisbrooke's family are so particular." Craddock dismissed her with a nod. Dr. Hayden entered, polishing his spectacles. He moved with the controlled precision of a man accustomed to hiding emotion behind professional detachment. "Mrs. Crestwell was my patient," he began. "I attended her husband in his final illness. There was disagreement. Concerning the certificate of death?" Hayden's jaw tightened. "Mr. Crestwell died of heart failure. I refused to certify unsound mind, as Mrs. Crestwell wished. Such a certificate would have released trust funds immediately. She dismissed me from the will in consequence. A substantial bequest?" £10,000, I believe. And the lease of the cottage I occupy. Craddock made a note. You were in the drawing room throughout? I was. I took a second cup of tea. It tasted perfectly normal. Yet Mrs. Crestwell died within minutes. Haydon replaced his spectacles. The poison must have been introduced after the first brewing. I examined the body cyanide beyond doubt. You have access to cyanide in your profession? Potassium cyanide is used in electroplating solutions for dental work. I keep a small quantity locked in my surgery. Craddock's eyes were steady. Thank you, Doctor. Miss Amy Pritchard swept in like a ship under full sail. Her gray hair was drawn so tightly that her eyebrows appeared permanently raised in disapproval. Lavinia Crestwell was a wicked woman, she announced without preamble. Pride, avarice, and malice, all the deadly sins in one black silk dress. Specific grievances, Miss Pritchard. She accused me of stealing lace at the church fete. Lace I had donated myself. The vicar believed her, of course. I was asked to resign from the Altar Guild. 20 years of service, and for a piece of Whodunit worth 6pence. Enough for murder? Miss Pritchard's lips thinned. I leave murder to the Almighty, though I confess I prayed she might be taken in her pride. Craddock permitted himself a faint smile. And the tea? I refused the second pot. It looked like ink. I have a delicate stomach. Mr. Geoffrey Spiller was last. He entered with the smooth assurance of a man who has never lost a case he did not wish to lose. His briefcase remained closed upon his knee. Mrs. Crestwell was my client, he began. I have managed her affairs for 15 years. The estate is complex investments in Kenya, trusts, annuities. And her intentions regarding the will? Spiller's fingers caressed the briefcase. She summoned me 2 days ago to discuss a codicil. She intended to revoke my position as executor and residuary legatee. A substantial portion, some £50,000, was to go to a home for distressed gentlewomen, leaving you with my usual fees. Nothing more. Craddock leaned forward. You lunched here on Tuesday? I did. Mrs. Crestwell wished to review documents. I was in the pantry briefly fetching writing paper at the maid's direction. The pantry adjoins the kitchen. It does. You are familiar with the Spode tea service? Spiller smiled thinly. Mrs. Crestwell was proud of it. Her husband purchased it in Vienna before the war. Craddock closed his notebook. That will be all for now. When the door closed behind the solicitor, Craddock remained motionless for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and took out the brown paper bags containing the tea things. He laid the saucer from Mrs. Crestwell's cup upon the desk. The white powder was clearly visible now, crystalline and deadly. Sergeant Lake whistled softly. Cyanide, sir? Undoubtedly. But look, Craddock tilted the saucer. The powder was concentrated in a thin line along the rim, exactly where a lip would rest, not in the tea itself. On the cup, Lake frowned. But the cup was clean after the first pouring. Exactly. The poison was applied between the two brewings. In the drawing room, the guests had been joined by Miss Marple, who had returned from a brief excursion to the kitchen, under pretext of fetching her dropped knitting needle. She resumed her seat, the picture of elderly inconsequence, but her ears were attuned to every word. Colonel Bantry was pacing. Damned if I'll be cooped up here like a criminal. I've a mind to telephone the chief constable. Dolly Bantry wailed. Arthur, they'll put it in the papers. Miss Pritchard sniffed. Better the papers than the grave. Dr. Haydon stood at the window, his back to the room. The village will be agog. Poor Mrs. Crestwell. Mr. Spiller opened his briefcase and took out a silver flask. A nip of brandy, anyone? Purely medicinal. The colonel accepted with alacrity. The others refused. Miss Marple's needles clicked. She was thinking of the pantry, the kitchen, the precise moment when the empty teapot had been carried away and returned refilled. She was thinking of the cracked glaze, the separate table, the white powder upon the saucer. And she was thinking of the human heart, which, like cyanide, could be concealed in the most innocent receptacle until the precise moment of use? The library door opened. Craddock entered, his face grim. "I have telephoned the Yard. A specialist in poisons is being sent down. In the meantime, I must ask you all to remain within call. The inquest will be tomorrow." Colonel Bantry exploded. "Inquest? Damned if I'll be dragged through." Craddock's voice cut like steel. "You will attend, Colonel, or be fetched. A woman has been murdered in her own home. The law will have its course." Silence fell, thick and oppressive. Outside, the frost glittered upon the gravel like scattered diamonds. Inside, the motives lay exposed like the roots of an upturned tree. Debt, disgrace, disinheritance, wounded pride, greed. And somewhere among them, Miss Marple reflected, was the single root that had borne the deadly fruit. She gathered her knitting and rose. "If you will excuse me, Inspector, I believe I shall take a turn in the garden. The air is bracing." Craddock hesitated, then nodded. "Sergeant Lake will accompany you." Miss Marple smiled gently. "As you wish. Though I assure you, Inspector, the murderer is unlikely to strike again in the hydrangeas." She moved towards the French windows, her small figure silhouetted against the wintry light. But her mind was busy with the pattern of the crime, and she knew that the next thread, when found, would lead inexorably to the hand that had held the poison. Chapter 5. The Cups. The morning of the inquest dawned with the pale sun that struggled through a veil of mist. Crestwell Lodge was hushed, the servants moving on tiptoe, the police constable at the door rubbing chilled hands. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her habit, and after a breakfast of toast and marmalade at Danemead House had walked the half-mile to the village hall where the proceedings were to be held. She wore her usual tweed coat and a felt hat that had seen better decades, and she carried a small string bag containing her knitting and a packet of bullseyes for emergencies. The hall smelled of varnish and damp hymnals. Rows of wooden chairs faced a trestle table behind which sat the coroner, Mr. Justice Mallow, a retired solicitor with a voice like a cracked bell. The jury 12 local worthies shifted uncomfortably in their Sunday suits. The guests from the tea party occupied the front benches, flanked by Inspector Craddock and Sergeant Lake. Dr. Farnsworth gave his evidence with professional detachment. Cyanide poisoning, death within 5 minutes of ingestion, stomach contents consistent with strong China tea and a trace of lemon. The laboratory report confirmed potassium cyanide in the dregs of the second pot and upon the shards of the broken cup. The first pot and the remaining cups were clean. The jury returned the expected verdict: murder by person or persons unknown. The coroner adjourned the inquest pending further police inquiries. The spectators filed out into the cold, their breath hanging like small ghosts. Back at Crestwell Lodge, Inspector Craddock had assembled the tea things upon the dining-room table. The spode set gleamed under the chandelier. The teapot, 6 intact cups and saucers, the milk jug, the sugar basin, and the fragments of the 7th cup laid out upon a sheet of white paper like the bones of a small animal. Miss Marple stood quietly to one side, her hands folded over the handle of her string bag. Craddock lifted the teapot. Cyanide in the dregs, yet the first brewing was harmless. The poison was introduced between the 2 infusions. He turned the cups. Mrs. Crestwell's cup from the first pouring clean, the cup that broke cyanide in the cracks of the glaze and upon the rim. The other 5 cups clean. Dr. Hayden, summoned from his surgery, examined the shards through a magnifying glass. "The cracks are old," he said. "Hairline fractures caused by repeated heating and cooling. A white crystalline deposit fills them, consistent with cyanide." Craddock's voice was sharp. "Could the poison have been painted into the cracks?" "Easily," Hayden replied. "A solution of potassium cyanide applied with a fine brush would dry invisible. Hot tea would dissolve it instantly." Miss Marple stepped forward. "May I, Inspector?" Craddock nodded. She took the largest shard the base of the cup and held it to the light. The pink roses were faded, the gold rim tarnished, but the network of cracks was clear, each fissure filled with a faint white line. "Observe," she said softly. "The cracks are deepest upon the inner surface, where the tea would strike first. And note the chip upon the rim here, upon the right side. A left-handed person holding the cup to admire it would naturally turn it so." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "Meaning the person who applied the poison knew which cup Mrs. Crestwell would use for her second pouring, and knew she always used the same cup, the one with the chip, because she disliked the feel of a perfect rim against her lip." Colonel Bantry snorted. "Stuff and nonsense. Anyone might have noticed the chip, but not everyone lunched here on Tuesday," Miss Marple said gently. "And not everyone was left alone in the pantry, adjoining the kitchen, while the maid fetched writing paper from the study." All eyes turned to Mr. Spiller. The solicitor's smile had thinned to a mere crease. "I was in the pantry for perhaps 30 seconds, he said. "Hardly time to poison a cup?" "Yet time enough," Miss Marple replied, "if the cyanide was already prepared in a small vial. A camel hair brush, a steady hand, and the deed is done. The cup is returned to its saucer upon the tray. Mrs. Crestwell herself carries the empty pot to the kitchen, refills it, and pours from it first, for herself using, as always, the cup with the chip." Dr. Hayden frowned. "But the poison was also in the dregs of the teapot." "A blind," Miss Marple said. "A few crystals dropped into the pot after the tea was poured to suggest the poison was in the brew itself, but the fatal dose was in the cup. The teapot was a distraction." Craddock picked up the saucer that had held the poisoned cup. "And this white powder upon the rim?" "Residue from the cracks," Miss Marple explained. "When the hot tea dissolved the cyanide, a trace overflowed onto the saucer. The rest killed Mrs. Crestwell." Silence filled the room. Outside, a blackbird sang in the yew tree, its note clear and indifferent. Craddock turned to Spiller. "You have cyanide in your possession?" Spiller's fingers tightened upon his briefcase. "I keep a small quantity in my London chambers for the eradication of wasps in the attic. A common enough precaution." "Yet you brought it to Willowbrook?" "I did not." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Then perhaps the laboratory will find traces in your flask, Mr. Spiller. The one you offered last night, purely medicinal, you said?" Spiller's face drained of color. "This is outrageous," Craddock signaled to Sergeant Blake. "Search the gentleman's briefcase." The locks clicked open. Among the papers lay a small glass vial, half full of white crystals. A laboratory label read, "KCN poison." Spiller stared at it as though it were a snake. I can explain." "I think not," Craddock said grimly. "Geoffrey Spiller, I arrest you for the murder of Lavinia Crestwell." The solicitor was led away, his protests echoing down the corridor. The dining room seemed suddenly larger, the air lighter. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be damned." The fellow seemed such a dry stick. Dolly Bantry began to cry again, this time with relief. Miss Pritchard sniffed. "Pride goeth before a fall, and avarice after it." Dr. Hayden replaced the magnifying glass upon the table. "A neat piece of work, Miss Marple, though I confess I missed the significance of the cracks." Miss Marple smiled. "One learns to notice small things, Doctor. In villages, one has time." Craddock approached her. "You have been most helpful, Miss Marple, though I confess I should have seen it sooner. You had the evidence, Inspector. I merely arranged it in the proper pattern." She gathered her string bag and moved towards the door. The spode set gleamed innocently upon the table, its secret revealed. Outside, the mist was lifting. The sun struck sparks from the frost upon the gravel. As she walked down the drive, Miss Marple reflected upon the fragility of porcelain and the deadliness of greed. Both, she thought, could be mended with care or shattered beyond repair. Chapter 6. The second pouring. The arrest of Geoffrey Spiller had not, as the village hoped, brought the matter to a neat conclusion. By the following afternoon, the news had spread through Willowbrook like bindweed. The London solicitor taken in handcuffs from Crestwell Lodge, the Spode cup in fragments, the vial of cyanide rattling in an evidence bag. Yet Inspector Craddock was not satisfied. He returned to the dining room where the tea things still lay under dust sheets, and he summoned the entire party once more. The frost had turned to a thin, reluctant sleet that tapped at the windows like impatient fingers. Craddock stood at the head of the table, the brown paper bags open before him. "Mr. Spiller has made a statement," he began. "He admits to purchasing potassium cyanide in London under the pretext of wasp control. He admits to carrying it in his flask. He admits to being alone in the pantry on Tuesday. What he will not admit is applying the poison to the cup." Colonel Bantry gave a short bark. "Then the fellow's lying." "Plain as the nose on your face." "Possibly," Craddock said. "But the timing troubles me." Mrs. Crestwell carried the empty teapot to the kitchen herself. She was absent no more than 3 minutes. Spiller was in the drawing-room with the rest of you. How did he know which cup she would use for the second pouring? Miss Marple, seated in the same chair she had occupied at the fatal tea, looked up from her knitting. Because, Inspector, he prepared the cup in advance, on Tuesday during luncheon. The maid remembers him admiring the Spode set. "Such delicate workmanship," he said. He turned the cups in his hands naturally, as one does with fine china, and being left-handed, he turned them so. She laid her needles aside and rose. Taking the largest shard of the broken cup, she held it so that the chip upon the rim caught the light. Observe the position of the chip. It is upon the right side as one drinks. A right-handed person would hold the cup with the chip away from the lip. Mrs. Crestwell, however, disliked the feel of an imperfect rim. She always rotated the cup so that the chip rested against her lower lip here. Miss Marple touched the spot with a gentle finger. A small vanity, but consistent. Mr. Spiller had observed it over 15 years of luncheons and teas. Dr. Hayden nodded slowly. "And the poison in the teapot?" "A blind, as I said." After Mrs. Crestwell poured for herself, and the Colonel Spiller had perhaps 10 seconds while attention was elsewhere. A pinch of crystals dropped through the spout, enough to taint the dregs, not enough to harm anyone who had already drunk. The real dose was in the cracks, dissolved by the hot second pouring. Craddock turned to the solicitor, who stood between 2 constables, his face gray. "Well, Mr. Spiller?" Spiller's tongue touched his lips. I have nothing to add." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Then perhaps the laboratory can add it for you. The camel hair brush in your briefcase size 00, ideal for gilding or for painting poison into hairline cracks. And the flask your fingerprints upon the vial, I presume?" Spiller's shoulders sagged. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. He sank into a chair, the picture of a man who has played his hand and lost. "It was meant to look like an accident," he said at last. "Or suicide. She had threatened to expose my mismanagement of the Kenya investments. £50,000 gone. She was to sign the codicil on Friday. I luncheon here on Tuesday, saw my opportunity. The cup with the chip, she always used it for the second pouring, disliked the taste of cooled tea. I painted the solution into the cracks with the brush, dried it with my handkerchief. Invisible. The first pot was safe. The second," he broke off, staring at the fragments as though they might reassemble and accuse him anew. Colonel Bantry muttered, "Good God." Dolly Bantry began to cry again, softer this time. Miss Pritchard's lips moved in what might have been a prayer of thanksgiving. Craddock signaled to the constables. "Take him away." As Spiller was led out, Miss Marple resumed her seat. The sleet had turned to rain. Water streaked the windows like tears. She picked up her knitting, the boutille now nearly complete. "One more thing, Inspector," she said. "The maid, Elsie Briggs. She is innocent, but frightened." A kind word would not go amiss. Craddock's stern face softened. "I am not a monster, Miss Marple. The girl will be questioned gently. He gathered the evidence bags. "The case is closed, thanks to you." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I merely noticed what was there to be noticed. Human nature is a richer brew than any tea, Inspector, and far more bitter when steeped too long in greed." The dining room emptied. The Spode set was packed away, the dust sheets replaced. Outside, the rain washed the frost from the gravel, leaving the world clean and cold. Miss Marple walked back to Danemead House under her umbrella, the finished bouquet in her pocket, a small, useless thing like justice, which arrives too late for the victim, but in time for the living. Chapter 7. The Confession. The Willowbrook police station was a modest red brick building beside the War Memorial, its cells smelling of carbolic and damp wool. Geoffrey Spiller sat upon the narrow cot, his London suit rumpled, his tie askew. The duty constable had removed his shoelaces and braces. The solicitor looked smaller without them, as though the trappings of respectability had been the scaffolding that held him upright. Inspector Craddock entered with Sergeant Lake and a shorthand writer. A single bulb glared from the ceiling, throwing harsh shadows across the whitewashed walls. Spiller did not look up. "Ready to make a statement, Mr. Spiller?" Craddock asked. The solicitor's voice was hoarse. "I have nothing left to lose. Let us be done with it." The shorthand writer's pencil began its soft scratch. "I have managed Lavinia Crestwell's affairs since 1919, Spiller began. "Her husband trusted me. She inherited the trust. The Kenya plantation was my idea. Coffee prices were soaring. I persuaded her to mortgage the home farm. The first 2 years were profitable. Then blight, drought, native unrest. By 1924, the investment was a sink. I transferred funds from other accounts to cover the losses her annuity, the village charities. She discovered the discrepancies last month." He passed a hand across his eyes. "She was furious. Threatened exposure, ruin, prison. I begged for time. She gave me until Friday to repay £50,000, or she would sign the codicil cutting me out entirely and send the papers to the Law Society." Craddock's voice was neutral. "So you decided to silence her?" Spiller nodded. "I purchased the cyanide in London, said it was for wasps in my chambers. Mixed a solution in a small bottle. On Tuesday, I lunched at the lodge. The maid left me alone in the pantry while she fetched writing paper. I knew Lavinia's habits. The Spode set, the cup with the chip, the second pouring. I painted the solution into the cracks with my gilding brush, dried it with my handkerchief. Invisible. The first pot would be harmless. The second—" He stopped, swallowed. "I dropped a pinch into the teapot after she poured, to mislead. I thought it would look like suicide despondency over the lost fortune, or an accident cyanide mistaken for sugar. I never imagined the cup would break. And the flask? Brandy for my nerves. I kept the vial in it safer than my pocket. You found it." Craddock closed his notebook. "Anything further?" Spiller looked up then, his eyes hollow. "Tell the maid I am sorry. She is a good girl. And tell Miss Marple." His voice cracked. "Tell her she is a witch." The shorthand writer finished. Craddock signed the statement. Then Spiller, his hand trembling so violently, the pen spluttered. In the corridor outside, Miss Marple waited with her string bag. She had come to return the constable's wife's knitting pattern and had been asked to remain. Craddock emerged, the confession in his hand. "It is complete," he said. "He has signed." Miss Marple inclined her head. "He was always precise, poor man. Precision is the solicitor's virtue and his undoing." Craddock offered his arm as they stepped into the sleet. "You will be needed at the assizes, Miss Marple. Your evidence about the cup will be given gladly, though I fear the jury will find the cracks in the glaze more eloquent than I." They walked in silence to the corner where the bus to Danemead House waited. The rain had softened to a mist. The War Memorial gleamed weightly. "One thing puzzles me," Craddock said. "How did you know it was the left hand?" Miss Marple smiled. I watched him sign the luncheon guest book on Tuesday. The pen moved from right to left across the page. A small thing, but murder is made of small things, Inspector. The bus conductor rang his bell. Miss Marple climbed aboard, her small figure dignified beneath the dripping umbrella. As the bus pulled away, Craddock raised his hat. He thought of the Spode cup, the chipped rim, the deadly cracks, and of the quiet elderly lady who had seen through them all to the poison beneath. In the cell, Geoffrey Spiller lay upon the cot, staring at the ceiling. The confession was done, the game lost. He thought of the drawing-room at Crestwell Lodge, the firelight on the roses, the moment when Lavinia Crestwell had raised the cup to her lips. He had won 15 years of safety and lost everything in a single sip. Outside, the mist closed over Willowbrook like a shroud. The case was closed, the murderer confessed, the cup in fragments. Yet somewhere in the village, a new teapot would be bought, new cups set out, and life fragile, treacherous, enduring would go on. Chapter 8. The Quiet Return 3 days after the confession. Miss Jane Marple boarded the 11:07 from Willowbrook to Paddington. The platform was slick with melted sleet. The station master touched his cap as she passed, a gesture half respect, half awe. Word had traveled faster than the train. The quiet lady from Danemead House had unmasked a murderer with nothing more lethal than a pair of knitting needles and a cup of tea gone cold. She traveled second class, as always. The carriage smelled of wet wool and coal smoke. Opposite her sat a commercial traveler reading the Daily Sketch. The headline screamed "Solicitor Poisons Heiress Over Kenya Losses." Miss Marple unfolded her copy of the Times and turned to the ecclesiastical news. The traveler glanced at her, recognized the face from the smaller photograph on page 5, and buried himself deeper in his paper. At Paddington, she took a taxi to St. Pancras, thence the branch line to her own village. The journey gave her time to reflect. She thought of Lavinia Crestwell, rigid in black silk, raising the fatal cup; of Geoffrey Spiller, precise and ruined, signing away his life in a whitewashed cell; of the Spode fragments locked in an evidence box, their pink roses forever silenced. Human beings, she mused, were more breakable than porcelain, and far less easily mended. The train drew in at dusk. Her own station was little more than a halt, a strip of platform, a signal box, a single lamp flickering against the dark. The porter, old Mr. Stringer, who had known her since she was a girl in pigtails, lifted down her small suitcase. "Evening, Miss Marple. Nasty business up at Willowbrook, they say. Very nasty, Mr. Stringer. But it is over now." He touched his cap again and watched her walk away, a slight figure in tweed, the suitcase swinging gently at her side. Her cottage stood at the end of the lane, its windows glowing amber. The maid, Cherry, had kept a fire banked and a kettle singing. Miss Marple hung her coat, slipped off her shoes, and sat in her own chair with a sigh that was half weariness, half content. The familiar creak of the springs, the faint scent of lavender from the bowl on the mantel, the tick of the bracket clock all welcomed her home. Cherry brought tea on a tray, brown bread and butter, a slice of seed cake, a single cup of her favorite Indian blendweek, with milk and 1 sugar. Miss Marple drank gratefully. The tea was perfect, no bitterness, no hidden depth. Later, when the fire had settled into ruby coals, she opened her writing case and penned a short note to her nephew Raymond. "My dear Raymond, thank you for the loan of Danemead House. The rest was most refreshing, though the local entertainment proved rather more dramatic than I anticipated. I return tomorrow. The ecclesiastical volume you lent me, Chapter 7 on Pisane, is particularly sound. Your affectionate Aunt Jane." She sealed the envelope, addressed it, and laid it upon the hall table for the morning post. Then she took up her knitting. The boutille was finished. She began another, pale yellow this time, for no one in particular. The needles clicked in the quiet room, a small, steady sound against the vast indifference of the night. Outside, The frost returned, crisp and clean. Inside, Miss Marple knitted and reflected. She thought of the drawing room at Crestwell Lodge, the shattered cup, the faces frozen in shock. She thought of the motives laid bare like cards upon a table: debt, fear, greed, pride. And she thought of the narrow line between the cup that gives life and the cup that takes it away. The clock struck 10. Cherry banked the fire, turned down the lamp, and withdrew. Miss Marple sat a little longer, her hands idle in her lap. Then she rose, placed the guard before the hearth, and climbed the stairs to her room. In the morning, the village would wake to its usual rhythm: the milkman's clop-clop, the church bells for early service, the baker's boy whistling as he peddled his rounds. No one would speak of poisoned tea or cracked glaze. The drama was over. The players dispersed. Only the quiet elderly lady in the cottage at the end of the lane would carry the memory, folded away like a pressed flower between the pages of her mind. She slept soundly, as those do who have looked upon evil and seen it for what it is. A small thing, after all, when set against the great, enduring pattern of human kindness. And in Willowbrook, the Spode set was sold at auction to pay the estate's debts. The teapot fetched 30 shillings, the 6 perfect cups a guinea each. The fragments of the 7th were thrown away. No one thought to keep them.